Racism is our problem. To stop it, we have to understand it. Hi, I'm Brian Brown, and this is Recap Video 1 in the series that I'm doing on structural racism in America for the East Hampton Public School District. Let's take a quick look at what we've learned. So far what we've been looking at is structural racism in the American South after the Civil War. As we saw, the Civil War was fought. It was fought over slavery. The states that seceded from the Union in order to try to keep practicing slavery lost, and several laws were passed to try to give some equal rights to African Americans. And we've seen how those rights were stripped away in various ways. This is a big takeaway on the idea of structural racism. That when people demand, when people fight for equality, racial equality in America, the system is able to pivot, it's able to keep the advantage that it has been trying to keep since the days of slavery. So let's take a quick look at some of the things we've learned. End of the Civil War, slavery ends, 13th Amendment. So the 13th Amendment is passed, and it means that there can be no more slavery in America except as punishment for crime. And so the southern states are able to pivot and say, okay, well, we're going to grab onto that except as punishment for crime. And black codes are passed. Black people who are now citizens and have full protection of the law are arrested on vagrancy charges and things like that, put into jail, and then rented out to plantations where they or other people like them had just been working as slaves, but now they're working as convicts. Why? Because they didn't have a place to live, because they didn't have money after hundreds of years of they and their ancestors being enslaved. So, 13th Amendment ends slavery, black codes continue slavery by pivoting, by using a loophole in the law. Okay, that's 13th Amendment. 14th Amendment is also passed during Reconstruction. The 14th Amendment guarantees, first of all, citizenship to African Americans and equal protection under the law. 1896 Supreme Court of Plessy versus Ferguson, which is trying to challenge discrimination in Louisiana. This attempt by Homer Plessy and the NAACP to try to strike down racial discrimination backfires, and as it turns out, the Supreme Court rules in a 7-1 decision that discrimination, that segregation is legal. Okay? That the 14th Amendment gives people equal protection under the law, but it doesn't mean that you can't have separate institutions. All right? And so separate but equal becomes the law of the land. So after Plessy versus Ferguson, the spirit of the 14th Amendment, which is supposed to guarantee equality for all Americans, Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court actually rules that racial segregation is totally okay, and which point that gives birth to the Jim Crow era. And so the era that we tend to think about when we think about the segregated South and, you know, the sort of worst times, you know, after slavery, for black people in the South, this is what we're talking about. So 14th Amendment says people are equal, that they have equal protection. Supreme Court says you can have separate but equal. And so then we have the southern states just run with this, and there's massive discrimination. We have talked about the fact that there is segregation in the North. Don't worry, we're going to get to the North. 15th Amendment says that black men can have the right to vote. All right? Controversial because it's the first time that that it says men have the right to vote, and specifying men, but not guaranteeing the right for women to vote. 15th Amendment gives black men the right to vote, and we see black men voting. We see black men being elected to important government positions, black jurors, all sorts of really great things happened during Reconstruction. Okay, but the legal pivot with the 15th Amendment has to do with things like poll taxes, literacy laws, and so on and so forth. So, yes, people have the right to vote. However, states create these very confusing tests, or these extremely hard tests that most people wouldn't pass. And then they discriminate, or they practice, their own discretion as to who actually has to take these tests or who has to pay these taxes. All right. Adopting a grandfather clause, the idea that if your grandfather could vote, you can vote, and so that is going to protect white people but not black people, and so the right to vote is more or less taken away. All right, and these are all sort of legal strategies that are used to maintain that powerful white people are in charge and black people are powerless, and any attempt at exercising their free rights as citizens is going to be thwarted. Okay, and so we see this, and this is an important part of what we're going to be learning about, because this is going to continue forward. All right. We also talked about violence and intimidation, and the idea that using the laws to take away people's rights is one thing, but violence and intimidation is another way to do it. Violence and intimidation sends a very strong message that if you step out of line, sure, you have the right to do these things like register to vote and so on and so forth, but if you do, there could be serious consequences for you, for your family, and so maybe you better not do that. All right, and we talked a little bit about the idea of double consciousness, which W.E.B. Du Bois talked about in many of the things that he wrote, including The Souls of Black Folk, which is probably his most famous book. And the idea of double consciousness meaning that, as he was talking about, an African American knows who they are, or sees themselves as who they are, and their potential and their hopes and their dreams and what they want to do, but they can't not look at themselves also through the lens of a society that holds them in contempt, that sees them as unequal, that sees them as a threat, that maintains all sorts of myths about who they are as a people. And so there's this double consciousness of, on the one hand, this is who you are and this is what you want, and on the other hand, how is society going to see that, and how is society going to react, and how painful or dangerous is this going to be for you? And so we looked at this in extreme forms as far as lynching goes, and some just how prevalent lynching was throughout the first half of the 20th century, and the fact that it still exists. The fact, certainly Emmett Till, probably the most famous person to be lynched, 14-year-old boy who's lynched. But how lynching really carries through until right now. People like Ahmaud Arbery, who was lynched, and we saw that on video. All of us in May, the video came out of that happening. So this threat of death if you go outside the lines, if you go outside of your role, all right, sends a very, very strong message, and it has a powerful effect on people not claiming their rights, not participating in full citizenship, all right? And who does it serve? Well, it serves people who might be voted out, right? People who have maintained their power, their wealth, their comfort through this system of racism. So going forward, we're going to look a little bit at the civil rights movement. We're going to look at some more theory. We're going to look at ideas behind things like white supremacy. And so in order to do that, we're going to take a bit of a further step back in history, look a little bit at European history and colonialism. We're going to talk about some psychological terms. And then we are going to look at the civil rights movement. Now, just a reminder, the real focus on this is on structural racism. And so this is not in any way, shape, or form a comprehensive look at the civil rights movement. But there is a whole episode that does talk about sort of 4 of the major groups and what their strategies were, just for a little positivity before we move into things like assassinations. So look, I am really excited that you've been checking this series out, and I hope you continue to check the series out. I recognize that that I could totally regret this, but I really want to for this to be a dialogue if it can be. So please, if you have questions, if you have thoughts, if you want me to follow up on something, please do so. Please put a question in the comments. Please put thoughts in the comments. And when I do my next recap on the next 5 videos, which should be released along with this video, I'd love to answer some questions. Okay? So thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope that you get something out of the next series of videos. I'll keep doing this, and looking forward to some questions. Okay? All right. Thanks for tuning in.